The stars had always been watching. That was a thought that crossed the mind of Dr. Amara Osei often, usually late at night, when the observatory on the edge of Accra hummed with the sound of cooling electronics and the sky above Ghana blazed with more constellations than any city dweller ever got to see. She was a radio astronomer. Her job was to listen. For 22 years, she had pressed her instruments against the fabric of the universe like a doctor pressing a stethoscope to a chest, hoping to hear something unexpected. On the night of October 14, 2041, she finally did. The signal was not what anyone had imagined. Science fiction writers had prepared the world for grand beams of coded mathematics, pulsing prime numbers, or the decoded coordinates of some distant world. What came instead was messy, overlapping, and faintly chaotic, like a crowd of people all trying to speak at once from very far away. It took Amara and her team 3 days and 4 sleepless nights to isolate the signal from background noise and confirm what they were hearing. By the time they did, the signal had already been picked up by 12 other listening stations on 6 different continents. The world did not learn about it from a government press release. It learned because a graduate student in New Zealand posted the raw frequency data online at 2 in the morning, too excited to wait for protocol. Within 6 hours, the story was everywhere. The public reaction was, in retrospect, both entirely predictable and quietly astonishing. There was panic, yes. Markets dropped, churches filled, social media became a wall of noise that no algorithm could contain. But alongside the panic, something else moved through the human population like a slow current under turbulent water. Curiosity. People dusted off old books on astronomy. Schools reported that more students showed up the next morning than had come the week before. In a small town in rural Japan, an elderly fisherman who had never owned a computer in his life walked to the local library and asked the young librarian to show him everything she had about the universe. He wanted to understand, he told her. He thought it was important to understand. That was the thing about humans that the universe had not yet learned. They were afraid, yes. But fear, for them, had never been the end of the story. It had always been the beginning. The ships appeared 6 weeks later. They did not announce themselves with fire or thunder. They simply arrived. 17 vessels, enormous beyond the scale of anything humans had built, hanging in low orbit like dark moons that had chosen the wrong planet. Each ship was roughly triangular, black as deep space, their surfaces broken by geometric patterns of faint blue light that pulsed slowly, almost like breathing. The militaries of the world went to full alert immediately. Missiles were armed. Fighter jets scrambled. Every submarine capable of carrying a nuclear warhead quietly slipped deeper into its respective ocean. And then nothing happened. The ships just hung there watching for 3 full days. It was the Secretary General of the United Nations, a soft-spoken former schoolteacher from Uruguay named Elena Marquez, who made the first real decision. She convened an emergency session and stood before the assembly with no prepared speech. She simply said, "We have 2 choices. We can point our guns at them and wait to see what happens, or we can try to say hello. I believe we should say hello. But I also believe we should say it carefully." The resolution that followed was not unanimous. But it passed. The response team was assembled over the course of 4 frantic days. It was not made up exclusively of generals or politicians, though both were present. It included linguists, mathematicians, musicians, behavioral ecologists, marine biologists, the last group chosen specifically because they had spent careers learning to communicate with minds that thought in fundamentally different ways, and one radio astronomer from Ghana who had been the first to hear the signal and who had not slept a proper night since. Amara Osei was included not because anyone was sure what she could contribute, but because it felt wrong to leave out the person who had started listening first. The contact attempt was humble by design. No weapons. No grand proclamations of humanity's greatness. Just a sequence of mathematical patterns broadcast on every frequency the alien ships seemed to be using, and then silence. A long, patient silence that lasted 36 hours before the answer came. What came back was not a language in any recognizable sense. It was more like a sensation, a vibration in the signal itself that the instruments translated as something close to amusement. The scientists debated furiously over what that meant. The linguist thought it meant the aliens found the attempt quaint. The behavioral ecologist, a wiry woman named Dr. Priya Nair who had spent 15 years studying whale song, had a different interpretation. She said it reminded her of how a dolphin sounds when it notices something it has never seen before. Not dismissive. Genuinely interested. Curious the way a child is curious. She was right. But she could not have known yet how much that curiosity would cost everyone before it turned into something useful. The first landing came on day 11. One shuttle descended from the lead ship, a small craft, relatively speaking, though it was still the size of a 12-story building laid on its side, and set down in the flat desert outside of Riyadh, in a zone the International Committee had hastily cleared and designated as a contact point. The shuttle sat there for 2 hours without opening. Amara, watching from a monitor station 3 kilometers away, thought it looked like a creature that was deciding whether or not to trust the air before it breathed. Then the door opened and they came out. There were 9 of them. They stood between 2 and 3 meters tall, with elongated limbs that moved with an unsettling fluid grace, as though their joints worked on slightly different principles than human joints. Their skin, if it could be called that, was a deep charcoal gray, covered in overlapping plates that shifted slightly when they moved, like the scales of a fish but flatter and more geometric. Their heads were wide and low, with 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal line across the upper face, each one a different shade of amber. They wore no visible equipment. No helmets, no suits. They breathed the Earth's air without apparent difficulty, and this small fact alarmed the scientists deeply, because it implied either that they had already studied the planet in exhaustive detail, or that they were built to survive almost anything. The lead alien, identified later as a commander-class individual based on subtle differences in coloring and posture, stopped 20 meters from the human greeting party and simply stood. Its 4 eyes moved independently, scanning each human face with unsettling thoroughness. Then it made a sound. Low, resonant, multi-layered, a sound that seemed to come from more than one source inside its body at once. The translation equipment the team had hastily assembled produced nothing useful. But Dr. Nair, sitting in the monitor station, quietly said, "It's introducing itself. Watch the posture. That's what introduction looks like." Amara looked at the alien. She thought about the fisherman in Japan who had walked to the library to understand. She thought about the graduate student who had posted the signal online at 2 in the morning because he was too excited to wait. She opened her channel to the lead diplomat on the ground, a composed former ambassador named James Okafor, and she said, "Tell them we're glad they came. But do it slowly. Take your time. Don't rush it." Okafor nodded once and turned to face the alien commander. He raised one hand, open palm forward, and waited. The alien looked at the hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, it raised one of its own, longer, darker, with 4 fingers spaced in a way that was almost but not quite human, and held it up in return. It was not a victory. It was not safety. But it was a beginning. Over the following weeks, the aliens, who communicated their name for themselves in a way that the linguists eventually rendered phonetically as the Varak, established a pattern of behavior that confused almost every strategic model the world's militaries had prepared. They did not demand territory. They did not threaten. They did not make any move that could reasonably be described as aggressive. Instead, they observed. Their smaller drones, disc-shaped, silent, nearly invisible against the sky, were spotted over every major city on Earth. They watched human traffic, human markets, human hospitals, human schools. They watched children play in parks in Istanbul and Nairobi and Seoul. They watched old men argue over chess boards in community centers in Buenos Aires. They watched and said very little, and this silence was in its own way more unsettling than any threat could have been. The military advisors grew increasingly restless. General Liu Wei of China's Strategic Command put it plainly in a closed briefing. "An enemy that doesn't show you its intentions is more dangerous than one that does. We are allowing them to map us completely, and we have no equivalent intelligence on them. This is an untenable position." Several of the other generals agreed. Plans were quietly drafted for a preemptive strike against one of the orbital vessels. The idea was not to destroy it but to damage it enough to demonstrate that humanity was not passive, not soft, not prey. The plans were never implemented, not because the committee stopped them, but because something unexpected happened first. One of the Varek drones descended low over a housing project in Cape Town on a Tuesday morning and hovered outside the window of a primary school classroom. Inside, a teacher named Mrs. Namsa Dlamini was in the middle of explaining long division to a group of 9-year-olds. The children saw the drone first. Several screamed. A few ran. But one small girl named Zola, 7 years old, with her school shoes on the wrong feet and a pencil behind her ear, walked directly to the window, pressed her palm against the glass, and stared at the drone with an expression of profound concentration. The drone hovered. Zola stared. Then she reached into her desk, pulled out a piece of paper, wrote a very large number 7 on it in orange crayon, and held it up to the glass. The drone was still for a moment. Then it projected a faint light against the school wall outside. In that light, the number 49 appeared. Zola looked at the 49. Looked at her 7. Held up 7 fingers, then 7 fingers again. Pointed at the wall. The drone projected 7 again. Mrs. Dlamini, who had been frozen near her desk, slowly sat back down. She picked up a piece of chalk. She wrote 7 by 7 on the board. She looked at the drone. The drone projected a new number. 7 times 7 is equal to 49, in characters that mixed Varrock symbology with a clear attempt at human notation. That footage, shaky, slightly out of focus, shot on a parent's phone from the hallway, was shared 14 million times before noon. The conversation humanity had been trying to start with 17 warships and emergency diplomatic protocols had been started by a 7-year-old girl with a crayon and a window. It was Dr. Priya Nair who first formally articulated what the Varrock were actually doing, in a paper she published quietly to an internal scientific channel that was leaked within hours. She wrote, "The Varrock are not here to conquer. They are not here to negotiate in any sense we conventionally understand. They are performing an evaluation. They are watching what we do when we are simply living, and they are comparing it against a set of criteria we do not yet understand. The question we should be asking is not how we defend ourselves from them, but what they are looking for and whether we have it." The paper caused a storm of argument. The military establishment hated it. The diplomatic corps found it too speculative. But a quiet, growing faction of scientists and strategists felt it resonated with everything the Varrock had actually demonstrated. The aliens had, after all, made no demands. They had not asked for resources or territory. They had simply watched. And the one time they had responded with anything approaching enthusiasm, it had been to a child doing mathematics in a classroom. Elena Marquez read Dr. Nair's paper 3 times in one evening. Then she called Amara Osei, who was still at the observatory in Accra, still listening to the Varrock frequencies with the same patience she had used for 22 years. "What do you think they want?" Elena asked. There was a silence on the line. Then Amara said, "I think they want to know if we're worth knowing. I think they've done this before with other species and they have a pattern for it. They watch until they've seen enough. And then they decide." Decide what? Whether to leave us alone or whether to do something else entirely. The something else was what nobody wanted to talk about. The answer to that unspoken fear came 43 days after first contact, when Commander Vel, the designation the humans had given the lead Varrock, requested a formal meeting with what it called, through the still imperfect translation system, the decision-makers of your species. The request itself was a small revelation. The Varrock had noticed that humans had multiple power centers. They had watched enough to understand that no single human spoke for all humans, and they were asking for whoever came closest to that. The committee assembled the most representative group they could manage in the time available. Heads of state from the 5 permanent UN Security Council nations, the Secretary-General, 3 leading scientists including Amara and Dr. Nair. The meeting took place aboard the Varrock landing craft, which had expanded its interior in ways that gently violated the humans' understanding of space and volume. The inside was much larger than the outside suggested, with ceilings high enough that the humans felt the specific vulnerability of small creatures in a large room. The walls were a dark, slightly luminous material that seemed to absorb and re-emit light in patterns. The temperature was comfortable, which the scientists later noted was another sign of profound prior research. The Varrock had set it to human preference, not their own. Commander Vel entered with 2 others and stood across a surface that approximated a table. Then it spoke, and this time the translation worked. Imperfectly, clumsily, with gaps and strange phrasings, but enough to convey the essential thing. The Varrock were part of something they called the Accord, a coalition of 41 spacefaring civilizations that had been operating for what translated roughly as several thousand of your years. The Accord was not a government. It was more like an agreement, a set of principles about how spacefaring species would relate to one another, how they would share knowledge, how they would handle disputes. Every species that achieved spaceflight was eventually found by the Accord, and when found, was evaluated. The evaluation was always the same: observation followed by a test. And the test was simple. The Accord would present a threat. A real one, or as real as could be manufactured. A danger to the evaluated species that required genuine response. The species would be watched. Not for whether they won or lost, but for how they responded. Whether they fractured or held together. Whether they led with cruelty or restraint. Whether their cleverest minds were given room to work, or silenced by their fearful ones. Whether, in the extremity of crisis, they revealed something that was worth preserving. Most species failed, Commander Vel said, without apparent judgment. Some became too aggressive too early. Some collapsed into factional violence before the threat even materialized. Some responded with such reflexive militarism that they destroyed more of themselves than the manufactured threat ever could. A few simply surrendered, concluding that resistance was futile, and in doing so revealed something about their spirit that the Accord regarded as disqualifying. The Varrock had been doing this for a very long time. They had seen many endings. Amara, who had been listening with her eyes half closed, opened them fully and asked, "What happens to the ones who fail?" Commander Vel's 4 eyes shifted. The translation came haltingly, "They are left as they are. We do not harm them. But they are set aside. The Accord does not involve itself with a species that has demonstrated it cannot be a good partner. We observe from distance. We do not interfere. For them nothing changes. But for us," said Elena Marquez quietly, "something would change. If you pass," said Commander Vel, "everything changes." The meeting ended shortly after. The humans walked back out into the desert heat of Saudi Arabia and stood in the sunlight and said nothing for a while. The implications were too large for immediate speech. They had just been told that they were on trial. That the trial was designed to test something real and deep about who they were. And that the Varrock were about to create the crisis that would decide their fate. They had 14 days to prepare, and in those 14 days humanity did something remarkable. It argued. Constantly, fiercely, sometimes bitterly. There were governments that wanted to use the preparation time to build weapons. There were governments that wanted to negotiate terms or conditions with the Varrock, trying to soften the test before it began. There were voices calling for the immediate evacuation of major cities, for the stockpiling of supplies, for martial law, for any number of hard, fearful responses that all came from the same place. A deep uncertainty about whether humanity could actually do this. But alongside all the argument and fear, something else happened that was quieter and faster and ultimately more important. Scientists shared data they had previously kept classified, because in the face of an existential challenge, national advantage seemed trivially small. Engineers from competing aerospace companies found themselves in the same rooms, looking at the same problems, without the usual walls of corporate secrecy between them. A retired AI researcher in Finland, watching the coverage on an old television in her kitchen, had an insight about pattern recognition in the Varrock signal frequencies and published it on a public forum, where it was picked up within hours by a team in South Korea and built into a translation tool that finally gave the contact linguist something close to a working grammar. She was 73 years old. She had been retired for 11 years. She had not published anything in a decade. But the problem interested her, so she worked on it, and the work mattered. Amara watched all of this from her observatory, still listening, still cataloging the Varrock frequencies, adding every new piece of information to a picture she was building in her mind. She barely slept. Her team brought her food she largely forgot to eat. She was trying to understand not just what the Varrock were saying, but what they were listening for. Because something told her that the test would not be purely a matter of brute survival. If the Accord was as old as Commander Vel suggested, it had seen species with far greater raw power than humanity come and go. Power was easy to evaluate and rarely what mattered in the long run. There was something else they were looking for. She found the clue in a narrow band of the Varrock signal spectrum that her instruments had initially dismissed as noise. When she isolated it and ran it through the new Korean-Finnish translation tool, it resolved into something that the tool rendered, imperfectly, as variety/difference/unexpected/many paths. She stared at that phrase for a long time. Then she called Elena Marquez and said, "I think I know what they're looking for. And I think it's actually something we're very good at." The test began on a Tuesday, which felt almost deliberately mundane. No drama in the timing. No announcement. The Varrock ships simply rearranged themselves in orbit, forming a pattern that ground-based sensors recorded but couldn't immediately interpret, and then a new object appeared in the upper atmosphere. A sphere, roughly 200 meters in diameter, descending slowly toward Earth. It emitted a pulse every 7 seconds. Each pulse disrupted electronic systems within a 5-kilometer radius. Phones died, power grids stuttered, vehicle automation failed. It was, by any measure, a controlled and limited threat. It was clearly manufactured to be survivable. But it was also clearly real, and it was clearly coming, and in the 14 days of preparation, every government on Earth had built a different plan for dealing with it. That was where the first human miracle happened, though almost no one called it that at the time. The Americans had prepared a kinetic interceptor, a missile designed to hit the sphere at high altitude before the pulse radius reached the surface in any significant way. The Chinese had built a directed energy weapon that operated on the frequency the sphere used for its pulses, theoretically capable of disrupting it. The Indians had assembled a network of distributed electromagnetic shielding across their major population centers, prioritizing protection over engagement. The Europeans had coordinated a digital resilience protocol that backed up and air-gapped their critical infrastructure on a rolling basis, making the pulse disruption largely irrelevant to their essential systems. And in the 14 days of preparation, a small team of engineers and physicists assembled at a facility outside of Nairobi, a team that included 3 people who had originally been part of Amara's observatory staff, had developed something entirely different, a way to talk to the sphere. The sphere, they had theorized, was not purely mechanical. Its pulse pattern was too regular, too precise, and it adjusted slightly each time the ambient electromagnetic environment changed, as though it was compensating. It was, in their assessment, some form of responsive system, maybe not intelligent in a human sense but adaptive. And if it was adaptive, it could be communicated with. Not through language but through the only language that had already proven to work: mathematics. The Nairobi team had built a broadcast array tuned to the sphere's pulse frequency. Instead of trying to disrupt or destroy it, they had designed it to pulse back, not in opposition but in pattern. A mathematical call and response. A conversation with a machine, conducted in the vocabulary the machine already spoke. No government had authorized this approach. It had emerged from a group of 12 people who had seen Amara's paper about variety/difference/unexpected/many paths, understood it, and decided to try something that was not in any official playbook. They had told no one because they were afraid of being stopped. The sphere descended to 40,000 meters and began its pulse sequence. In the first 5 seconds, 3 commercial flights lost navigation systems and dropped to manual. A power station in Kazakhstan flickered and went to backup. Traffic systems in Tehran crashed. Then the American missile was fired. Clean, fast, brilliant engineering, it struck the sphere at high altitude with enough force to have destroyed most things. The sphere absorbed the impact, shifted 11 degrees on its axis, and continued its descent. The pulse changed frequency. Now it operated on a band that the kinetic strike had apparently been calibrated to avoid, as though the sphere had anticipated the attack and prepared an alternative. The Chinese energy weapon engaged next. It performed exactly as designed, which is to say it worked and did not work simultaneously. It disrupted the pulse on its original frequency but had no effect on the new one, because the weapon had been calibrated against data gathered in the first 48 hours of the sphere's emission, and the sphere was no longer the same system it had been then. It had adapted. In adapting, it had also slowed its descent slightly as though recalibrating itself, and this gave the Nairobi team their window. The broadcast array came online at 0347 UTC. It sent a pulse, the simplest possible mathematical sequence, a series of primes ascending from 2. The sphere's descent halted. Its pulse shifted again, this time to a frequency that the translation team, monitoring frantically from a relay station in Addis Ababa, identified as responsive rather than disruptive. It was not, they quickly determined, the same mathematics they had sent. It was a different sequence, prime adjacent but not prime, a subtler pattern, as though it was asking a question rather than echoing an answer. One of the 12 in the Nairobi team was a 26-year-old mathematician named Elon Brightwater, who had grown up in a reserve in British Columbia and had a particular gift for seeing structure in chaotic systems. She looked at the sphere's response pattern and said very quietly, "It's not primes. It's the gaps between primes. It's asking us if we see what it sees." She sent back the gaps. Twin prime differentials. She sent them slow, then fast, then in a pattern that was itself structured, demonstrating not just knowledge but understanding of the structure. The sphere hovered. 12 seconds of silence in which nobody breathed. Then it sent back something new, the Fibonacci sequence, but not beginning from 1. Beginning from the 44th number, deep in the sequence, a number large enough that recognizing it required genuine comprehension, not rote pattern matching. Elon laughed. It was a strange sound in the tense silence of the control center. Then she pulled up her keyboard and sent back the 45th. The sphere stopped its descent. It held position for 9 minutes. Then it rose. Slowly at first, then faster, back up through the atmosphere. The pulse faded. The power systems it had disrupted flickered back to life. The sphere rejoined the Varrock fleet in orbit and disappeared. The silence that followed was not the silence of relief. It was the silence of people who were not yet sure what had happened. Commander Vell contacted the committee within the hour. The translation came through with more clarity than it ever had before, as though the Accord had decided it was time to stop being elliptical. "The evaluation has been completed," it said. "We have observed enough." Elena Marquez, who had not slept in 30 hours, sat across from the camera and said, "What did you see?" Commander Vell was still for a moment. Then it said, We saw what we always hope to see and rarely do. You fractured as all species fracture under pressure. Some of your members chose force and it was not wrong. It demonstrated capability. Some chose protection and that was not wrong. It demonstrated care for your own. But some chose to listen to the threat instead of striking at it, and that, above all other things, is what the Accord values. Not because listening is always successful, but because a species that can imagine that the unknown thing might be spoken to rather than destroyed, is a species that can grow without consuming everything around it. We almost didn't, said Amara, who was in the room. The Nairobi team worked without authorization. We didn't even know about them until after. Yes, said Commander Vel, we know. We found that the most interesting thing of all. There was something in the alien's tone, something in the way its 4 amber eyes settled on Amara and held, that suggested the word interesting was carrying more weight than the translation could fully express. Something closer to admiration, perhaps. Or recognition. The weeks that followed were, in every quiet and significant way, the most important weeks in human history. The Varrock ships did not leave. They repositioned, still in orbit, but in a configuration that the tactical teams eventually stopped analyzing as a threat pattern because it wasn't one. It was a welcoming arrangement. A posture of openness. Like chairs arranged around a table rather than a fortress around a city. The Accord began to transmit. Not weapons, not ultimatums, but information. 41 civilizations, each with their own history, their own discoveries, their own hard-won understanding of a universe that was far stranger and more populated than humanity had ever quite allowed itself to believe. The transmissions arrived in carefully packaged bundles, each one designed to be understood at humanity's current level and then extended, beginning at the edge of human knowledge and gesturing outward. It was the single greatest transfer of knowledge in human history, and it arrived not as a gift but as an introduction. This is what we know. We offer it as a beginning. The scientific community, which had spent decades arguing over funding and priority and publication rights, found itself suddenly and completely united by a problem that was large enough to make all previous arguments look like disputes over seating arrangements on a very small boat. Every major research institution on Earth redirected resources toward understanding the transmitted knowledge. New partnerships formed within days that would have taken years in a previous age. Languages of science that had been mutually unintelligible began to develop bridges. The mathematicians and the biologists and the physicists and the engineers found themselves in the same rooms again, staring at the same extraordinary problems, with the specific energy of people who know the work genuinely matters. Amara was appointed to lead the Earthside interpretation team, a role that would occupy the next 30 years of her life and that she would later describe in her memoir as the strangest and most wonderful form of listening I ever did. She still visited the observatory when she could. She still found the night sky the best place to think. But she thought different thoughts now, larger ones, about a universe that had been out there the whole time, full of minds and histories and questions she had not even known to ask. There was a moment, about 3 months after the evaluation ended, that Amara thought about often in the years that followed. It happened at the observatory late at night, when the team had gone home and she was alone with the instruments. She was calibrating a new receiver array designed to pick up the broader Accord frequencies, signals from worlds so distant that the light had traveled for centuries to reach her equipment. She was thinking about Commander Vel's words. About what the Varrock had found most interesting. Not the missile, not the energy weapon, not even the mathematical conversation with the sphere. The fact that the Nairobi team had worked without authorization. The fact that 12 people had decided on their own to try something that wasn't in any playbook, that no general had approved and no politician had sanctioned, simply because they thought it might work. In a species that had more rigidly organized itself. Where every response to a threat was channeled through a single chain of command, where deviation from the approved strategy was punished rather than permitted, those 12 people would never have had the chance to try. The sphere would have been fired at until it couldn't be fired at anymore, and the conversation that stopped it would never have happened. The Varrock had not been looking for perfect obedience. They had been looking for the capacity to surprise, not just enemies but themselves. Amara sat in the dark and thought about this, and she thought about the 7-year-old girl with the crayon, and the fisherman who walked to the library, and the graduate student who posted the signal at 2 in the morning, and the 73-year-old researcher who came out of retirement because the problem interested her, and all the thousands of other people who had done the unexpected thing because something in them was still alive enough to look at a new situation and ask a new question. She thought, that is who we are. That is actually who we are. Not the missiles, though the missiles were real. Not the fear, though the fear was real. But the girl with the crayon. The old man who wanted to understand. The mathematician who laughed in the middle of a crisis because she saw something beautiful in the pattern of a spherical threat from space. Those people were the thing. Those people had always been the thing. The Varrock remained in orbit for 2 years. During that time they shared more knowledge, facilitated communication with 3 other Accord member civilizations, and with characteristic patient thoroughness, continued to observe. They watched humanity absorb the new information and struggle with it and fight over it and misuse parts of it and use other parts brilliantly. They watched the arguments about how to distribute the technological advantages that came with Accord membership. They watched the nations that tried to monopolize the new knowledge and the scientists who refused to let them. They watched a 9-year-old boy in the Philippines build a working model of an Accord-style energy harvester from information he had found in the public translation archives and a box of electronic components he had ordered online, and they noted it with the same careful interest with which they had noted everything else. They watched humanity be human. Messy, brilliant, infuriating, occasionally inspired, frequently disappointing, and never, ever predictable. When Commander Vell's ship finally began its departure sequence, a long, graceful spiral out of Earth's orbit that was itself clearly performed with attention to human observation, an acknowledgement that they knew they were being watched, the commander sent one final transmission. It was longer than most of the others and took the translation team the better part of a day to render into something usable. When they did, Elena Marquez read it aloud to an assembled group of scientists, diplomats, and in the corner of the room, one radio astronomer who had been listening for 22 years before anyone answered. The message said, "We have evaluated many species. We have welcomed some into the Accord and watched others remain as they were, unable to grow beyond their own limits. You are unlike the others in a way that is difficult for us to fully express, because it is a way that comes from what seems like a fundamental contradiction in your nature. You are simultaneously afraid and curious. You are simultaneously violent and gentle. You are simultaneously rigid and flexible, loud and quiet, certain and uncertain. Other species resolve these tensions. They choose. They become primarily one thing or primarily another, and in doing so they achieve stability, but they also lose something. You do not seem to resolve these tensions. You carry them with you always, and the friction of them seems to be exactly what produces the unexpected things you do. We do not know if this will remain true, but we believe it is worth protecting and we are glad we came to see it. You have more to learn and so do we. We will speak again." The room was quiet for a long time after Elena finished reading. Then Amara, who was standing near the window looking at a sky that had just resumed being just a sky, said, "They're glad they came to see it." She paused. "So are we. History does not always move in the ways that the people living through it expect it to. The generation that came after the Varrock's visit grew up in a world that was changed in deep and quiet ways, not yet transformed into anything science fiction had quite imagined, but subtly different in its attitudes and its sense of possibility. Young people who had been children during the contact events grew up understanding, in a bone-deep way that could not be argued out of them, that the universe was populated and that humanity's place in it was not given but earned. They grew up knowing that the earning had been done not primarily through military strength, though strength had played its part, but through something harder to name and much harder to train, the willingness to try the thing nobody had thought to try, to ask the question that wasn't on any official list of approved questions, to see the unknown thing and move toward it instead of away from it. General Liu Wei, who had argued for a preemptive strike in those first dangerous weeks, lived to give a speech at the opening of Earth's first Accord interface facility in Shanghai. He was 81 years old and moved with a cane, but his voice was clear. He said, "I was wrong about what we needed most. I thought we needed to demonstrate strength. We did demonstrate strength, but it was not the strength I was thinking of. It was the strength to let 12 people work on an idea that nobody had approved, because the idea was good and the situation was real and the world needed everyone thinking. That is a harder kind of strength than any weapon. I did not understand it then. I understand it now." He sat down to a silence that turned, slowly, into something that was not quite applause, more like a long, collective exhale of recognition. Elon Brightwater, the mathematician who had sent the Fibonacci sequence, spent the next decade working on the Accord transmissions with a team that grew to include researchers from 40 countries. She never forgot the moment of laughing in the middle of the crisis, and she thought about it often, about what it meant that she had laughed. She had laughed because she had seen something beautiful. A pattern inside a danger. A conversation inside a threat. A mind, or something like a mind, reaching out in the only language it had, which happened to be a language she spoke. She wrote later that the moment had changed the way she thought about everything she encountered. "I started asking, of every difficult thing, whether it was actually trying to tell me something. Not always. Not most of the time. But sometimes. And sometimes was enough. Dr. Priya Nair, whose paper about the Varek's evaluative behavior had changed the direction of humanity's response, went back to studying whale song the following year. She said the whales had new things to teach her and she had been away too long. She published 3 more papers in the following decade and gave a lecture series that was attended by, among others, the Secretary-General of the United Nations and a Varek cultural observer who had chosen to remain on Earth to continue studying humans at closer range. The cultural observer, whose name was rendered in human speech as something close to Keth, sat in the back of the lecture hall and listened with all 4 eyes to a human explain how one species learns to understand another, and was reported by several audience members to be exhibiting what, if you knew what to look for in Varek body language, could only be described as deep, genuine attention. Zola, the 7-year-old who had held up the orange 7 for the drone outside her classroom window, grew up to be an aerospace engineer. She worked on Earth's first joint human accord vessel, a research ship designed according to principles shared by 7 different member civilizations, adapted by human engineers who had, as they always did, added things nobody expected. One of the things they added was a library. Not a digital archive which any ship would carry, but a physical library, shelves and books and a reading chair. The Accord engineers who reviewed the design were confused by this. Libraries could be far more efficiently implemented as data systems. Why the physical objects? Zola explained that there were things that happened in the presence of physical books. The weight of them, the smell, the act of choosing and holding, that changed the quality of thinking. She couldn't prove it scientifically, she said. She just knew it to be true and it mattered enough to include. The Accord engineers registered their puzzlement and made a note of it, one of thousands of notes they had been making about humans since first contact. The notes were added to a growing document that circulated through the 41 member civilizations under a title that, translated into English, meant something like, "The Humans, What We Know So Far, which is less than we expected, which is also more than we expected." It was the most widely read document in the Accord in the decade following Earth's admission. Several civilizations requested updates on a regular basis. The Varek transmitted one annually. It never got shorter. It always got longer. Every year, humans did more things that nobody had anticipated and that required fresh documentation. The galaxy had expected to find many things on the small blue planet that had been emitting strange radio signals for a century before anyone from the Accord went to look. It had expected perhaps a mid-stage civilization, resource-rich but strategically unsophisticated. It had expected, if it found intelligence, the usual patterns: tribalism resolving into unity under pressure, followed by a predictable trajectory of technological development, followed eventually by the familiar choices that determined which direction a civilization would take. It had not expected the Orange 7. It had not expected the laughing mathematician. It had not expected 12 unauthorized people in Nairobi having a mathematical conversation with an evaluation sphere. It had not expected the retired researcher who came out of retirement because the problem interested her. It had not expected the fisherman who walked to the library. It had not expected that the most strategically significant event in Earth's first contact history would be a child pressing her hand against a window and deciding to say hello. The Accord had been doing this for thousands of years. It had patterns, expectations, a statistical model of how species behave. Humanity had broken the model in 17 different places before the first year was done, and in 34 more in the following decade, and showed no sign of stopping. There is a small plaque now, mounted near the door of Earth's Accord Interface Facility in Cape Town, not far from the school where a 7-year-old held up a crayon number and started a conversation that would change the world. The plaque was designed by a committee which usually produces things that are careful and dull, but this committee made an exception. The plaque shows a child's hand against glass, and a drone hovering, and between them the number 7 in orange. Below the image, in 37 languages, the 36 official languages of the United Nations and Varek, in their own geometric script, it says, "We were not the largest. We were not the oldest. We were not the most powerful. But we were curious and we were brave, and when the unknown came to our window, we held up what we had and said, 'Here. This is what I know. What do you know?' That is the thing that the Varek found in the evaluation, the thing that the Accord had not quite expected and could not quite categorize. Not the missiles, which were real and dangerous. Not the political structure, which was complicated and imperfect. Not even the mathematics, which was genuine and impressive for a species of their age. What they found was something that even the oldest civilizations in the galaxy had largely grown out of: the refusal to accept that any gap between self and other was unbridgeable. The specific, stubborn, possibly irrational human insistence that understanding was worth attempting. That the door could be opened. That the conversation was worth having. That even a sphere descending from orbit on a pulse frequency was, if you looked at it right, something to listen to rather than simply something to fear. The universe is large and it is old and it has seen many things end. It has seen civilizations rise in glory and collapse in darkness. It has seen species that reached for the stars and found nothing there to hold. It has seen the slow quiet fading of worlds that ran out of time or will or both. Against all of that, against the scale and the age and the weight of everything, 41 civilizations now count among their number one small, noisy, contradictory, endlessly surprising species from a planet orbiting an unremarkable star in a mid-range galactic arm, who looked at the unknown and chose, again and again, to listen. That choice was not easy. It was not safe. It was not always right. But it was human, completely and thoroughly human, and the universe, after everything it had seen, found that it was glad. Subscribe if you are a warm-hearted human.